Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Before we begin, it's important to make one thing clear. The cases discussed in this episode are unproven. Ivan Milat was convicted of 7 murders, and those are the only killings for which he was found guilty in court. While investigators examined numerous unsolved disappearances and murders for possible links to Milat, no definitive evidence has connected him to most of these cases. What follows is an examination of those investigations, the questions they raised, and the mysteries that remain unsolved. Officially, Ivan Milat murdered 7 people. 7 backpackers whose bodies were discovered in Belanglo State Forest. 7 murders that shocked Australia and transformed Milat into one of the country's most notorious criminals. For the courts, the story is straightforward. The evidence was presented, a jury delivered its verdict, and Milat spent the rest of his life behind bars. But after his conviction, detectives began asking a troubling question. What if Belanglo wasn't the beginning? As investigators examined Milat's past, they found themselves revisiting decades of unsolved cases. Missing hitchhikers, young travellers who vanished while moving between cities, women who disappeared without explanation, and murders that had never resulted in arrests. Some of these cases appeared to overlap with Milat's movements and known behaviour. Others shared similarities that were difficult to ignore. None of it proved anything, but it was enough to keep investigators looking. Tonight, we're exploring the cold cases that drew police attention, the victims whose families are still searching for answers, and the possibility that the full extent of Ivan Milat's violence may never be known. Following Milat's conviction, police undertook an extensive review of unsolved cases from across Australia. Reports over the years have suggested that investigators examined more than 50 disappearances and murders for potential links. That number alone raised eyebrows. It wasn't because detectives believed Milat was responsible for every case. Most of them lacked sufficient evidence to identify any offender, let alone connect them to a convicted serial killer. Instead, the reviews were driven by a simple concern. The Belanglo murders suggested experience. And by the time the first known victims disappeared in 1989, Milat was already in his mid-40s. Detectives questioned whether someone capable of carrying out multiple murders over several years could have begun offending much earlier. His work history, frequent travel, and familiarity with remote areas only added to the speculation. Investigators weren't looking for certainty, they were looking for patterns. And in some cases, those patterns appeared unsettlingly familiar. One of the most frequently discussed cases is the murder of Keren Rowland. In 1971, the 19-year-old Canberra woman disappeared after accepting a lift. Her body was later discovered near Fairbairn. She had been strangled. Despite extensive investigations, nobody was ever convicted. For decades, Keren's murder remained one of Australia's most frustrating cold cases. After Milat's arrest, detectives revisited the file. The reasons were understandable. Keren was young, vulnerable, and believed to have encountered her killer while travelling. The crime occurred in an isolated location, away from witnesses. Those similarities prompted investigators to consider whether Milat could have been involved. However, no evidence ever emerged to support that theory. No forensic link, no witness, and no confession. As a result, Keren's murder remains unsolved. More than 50 years later, her family still lacks the answers they were promised. Some mysteries are haunting because there is a crime scene. Others are haunting because there isn't. Michelle Pope disappeared in 1980 while travelling to university in Sydney. The 18-year-old was last seen waiting at a bus stop. Then she vanished. Despite extensive searches and decades of investigation, no trace of her has ever been found. No body, no confirmed sightings, no explanation. Her disappearance became one of Australia's most enduring missing person cases. When police reviewed possible Milat connections, Michelle's name surfaced repeatedly. Her age, the circumstances of her disappearance, and the era in which it occurred placed her among the cases investigators felt compelled to examine. Yet once again, there was no evidence capable of proving a connection. The result was another dead end. For Michelle's family, the uncertainty has lasted more than 4 decades. And uncertainty can be its own kind of punishment. In 1980, 21-year-old Stephen Lapthorne set out on a hitchhiking journey from Victoria to Sydney. Like many young Australians at the time, he relied on strangers for transport. He never reached his destination. Years later, his remains were discovered in bushland. The circumstances surrounding his death generated considerable speculation, particularly after Milat's conviction. Stephen's case contained several elements that investigators had seen before: a young traveller, a roadside journey, and a disappearance that ended in violence. Police explored the possibility of a connection, but as with many of the cases reviewed, speculation ultimately outpaced evidence. No definitive link was established. His murder remains unsolved. To understand why so many of these cases attracted attention, it's important to understand Australia back in the 1970s and 1980s. Hitchhiking was common. Backpacking culture was thriving. Young people regularly travelled long distances with little more than a backpack and a willingness to trust strangers. The risks were barely considered. There were no smartphones, no location tracking, no instant communication. If someone disappeared between towns, it could take days before anyone realised something was wrong. And for predators, those conditions created opportunities that would be far more difficult today. That reality complicates the investigation of historical cases. Many disappearances from that era share similar characteristics because the circumstances of travel were similar. A young hitchhiker vanishing along a highway does not automatically point to a serial killer. But when investigators looked back through decades of unsolved cases, they found enough similarities to justify asking difficult questions. Even after Milat was convicted, some detectives remained convinced there were unanswered questions buried in old case files. Not because they had proof, because they had doubts. But several investigators publicly acknowledged that they could not completely rule out the possibility of additional victims. Journalists examining the case reached similar conclusions. Again and again, they encountered the same obstacle: time. Cold cases become harder to solve with every passing year. Witnesses move away or die, memories fade, evidence deteriorates, opportunities disappear. As decades passed, the chances of obtaining definitive answers grew smaller, yet the questions remained. Ultimately, there may have been only one person capable of resolving the mystery: Ivan Milat himself. If he committed additional murders, he knew. If investigators spent years pursuing the wrong theories, he knew that too. But throughout his imprisonment, Milat refused to cooperate. He denied responsibility for the murders that he had already been convicted of. He offered no meaningful insight into the countless theories surrounding his past. As his health declined, some hoped that he might finally confess. Others believed that he would reveal the location of unknown victims. But neither happened. On October 27th, 2019, Ivan Milat died in prison. Whatever secrets he carried went with him. Officially, Ivan Milat murdered 7 people. Those 7 victims are the only murders proven in court. Everything beyond that remains uncertain. Yet the questions persist because investigators spent years examining cases that seemed, at least on the surface, to intersect with Milat's life. Some of those cases may never be solved. Some may have nothing to do with him at all. Others continue to trouble detectives and families alike. The truth is that nobody can say with certainty whether Ivan Milat's victim count ended at 7. And now, nobody ever may. That uncertainty remains one of the darkest aspects of the entire case. Because long after the trial ended, and long after Milat died, there are still families waiting for answers. And there are still cold cases that refuse to stay buried. This has been Coffee and Crime, and I'll see you in the next one. Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.